Welcome to Dynamic Boards NED Community Meetup. I'm hosting today's meetup. My name is Ketan Varia. By profession, I'm an engineer, and my career has been working in large change projects. My NED experience includes sitting on a board of a large NHS trust, being a school governor for 8 years. Currently, I sit on the board of a not-for-profit organisation, Mediation Hertfordshire. Our speaker today is Tony. Tony can look down both sides of the government fence. He was a housing association CEO for 37 years. Must have started very young, Tony, working with 11 different chairs during that time. He chaired the National PlaceShapers, which is a large community-based value-focused association group, for 5 years. Since he retired last year, he has chaired Sheffield's Business Improvement District, the Baton of Hope, which is a suicide prevention charity, and also the Regional Al-Anon group for families of alcoholics. So that's great, Tony. I mean, your experience is just incredible. So over to you now for your talk. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Ketan. So probably my typo, Ketan, but it's actually the PlaceShapers group. It was a group of associations who were really committed to working in their local areas. So that's just tidying that one up. So Ketan mentioned that I chair the Regional Al-Anon group. That's a group for friends and families of alcoholics. It's, if you like, a sister fellowship to AA, which I'm sure you have all heard of. Al-Anon has some incredible literature, and one of my favorite leaflets is headed up, "What do you think living is for?" Which I think is just a really interesting question. It's such a simple question. What do you think living is for? And I'm just going to tweak that a little bit to get started and change it to what do you think leading is for? In other words, what's the leadership challenge? And I'm going to come up with my definition of that, which I used for many years during my career as a touchstone. Whenever I was not sure about the purpose of strategic planning, culture, etc., etc. What do you think leading is for? And my answer to that is to create the maximum impact for the customer with the resources available to you. And I think that definition reads across all governance settings, whether they're regulated or unregulated, for-profit organizations, charities, etc. Create the maximum impact for the customer with the resources available to you. So how, as an NED in a leadership role, trying to respond to that challenge, can you do that? And my answer, again, is a very simple answer to that, which is to bring your whole self into the room. And what I mean by that is to bring in your experience, your lived experience, your personality, but also much more than just your intellectual, mental intelligence. And again, a very simple definition for me that worked very well for me is that we have 4 intelligences, 4 ways of being intelligent. Mentally, obviously, emotional intelligence is pretty well understood now, but I would add to that physical intelligence. So as you're sitting there now, you may be feeling all kinds of things in your tummy, in your ears, who knows, your fingertips may be tingling, all kinds of things. So what is that telling you? And as we sit in a meeting for a couple of hours, our bodies will tell us all kinds of different things. And I think it's worth tuning into that and trying to think about what's actually going on. And then finally, my 4th intelligence is spiritual intelligence. And I should say I'm not in the slightest bit religious. I'll take on anybody for an arm wrestle as the least religious person on this Zoom call. But I do believe that we are spiritual beings and that we have access to other forms of intelligence. You can call it the universe, you can call it instinct, you can call it hunches, just those things that sometimes you're just walking along and a thought pops into your head and you just think, where on earth has that come from? And I would include within that spiritual intelligence just a wish to do well for our fellow human beings and connect with our fellow human beings. So I would say, bring your whole self into the room and bring your 4 intelligences into the room. So what does all that actually mean? And I've got about half a dozen bullet points here now just to run through with you. My first point is courtesy to all. Courtesy is not a particularly fashionable word, courtesy. People tend to focus on kindness a lot, but I just think manners, not interrupting people, encouraging people, just smiling at people, engaging people, giving them feedback. Or if somebody's saying something, just responding. You don't have to sit there like the Churchill dog nodding away, but just engage and don't spend all your time looking at your notes, that kind of thing. So firstly, courtesy. Secondly, read the room. There are all kinds of things going on. If you've got a dozen people in a room, there will be all kinds of things going on in people's minds, people's emotions, whether they feel comfortable or not, whether something is going well, whether a discussion is going well, is it going in the right direction? And what I mean by that is not sort of people please make sure that everybody has a jolly fine time, because some discussions could be extremely uncomfortable and perhaps rightly so. But I'll never forget. So Ketan is right. I've been a chief executive since I was 31. And one of the very first things that I heard when I spoke to a group of our tenants, this chap said to me, I said, well, what do you want if we're going to involve you in tenant participation in the decision-making of the organisation? What would you want? Expecting that he'd say something like, oh, I want to improve the services for people and what have you. And what he actually said was, I want to be happy. I want to be happy at the end of the meeting. I want to have had a good experience. Even if we're uncomfortable, even if we're being challenged and feel uncomfortable, nevertheless, it should be a good experience for everybody in the room. And if somebody isn't engaged, I mean, you know the kind of thing, you'll see somebody who maybe hasn't said anything on a particular item, but you just know underneath that they don't agree with what's going on. And maybe just a word, just a sort of, Joe, you haven't said anything very much. I just sense maybe you don't agree with this. Just including people, bringing people in. Then include, of course, you know, we're all switched on to what it means to be inclusive, aren't we? And certainly we were at South Yorkshire Housing Association, but we had an issue there for several years, actually, of chatty men. In other words, we had a very good balance on the board in terms of women with neurodiversity. We had tenants on the board, we had accountants on the board, etc. Good balance of male and female. But very often, the men used to dominate the discussions, and we couldn't understand why, because these were really intelligent women in the room. And we'd speak to them afterwards, and they would give us feedback along the lines sometimes of, well, by the time so-and-so had finished talking, I realized we'd been on the item for 10 minutes. And what I had to say maybe had already been said, or it wasn't going to add anything. So I just bit my tongue. And it's those kinds of things. Just work out what's going on. The kind of the unconscious biases, the privilege, all of those kinds of things. The next one I've got is about the voice of the customer. So in the housing association sector, all of you will have heard of and read about the Grenfell disaster. Well, the Grenfell tragedy happened in the boardroom of the largest tenants cooperative organisation in the country. And yet the tenants who lived in Grenfell Tower, who were saying we don't feel safe, were ignored. They were ignored because actually the priority of the people who were in the room at that time were value for money, technical issues, etc., rather than actually listening to the voice of the customers. My next one is pre-mortems. So again, you've all heard of post-mortems. It might be worth thinking in advance of doing a big project, what could go wrong, and planning what kind of strategies to follow in order to check that out. My next one is be Columbo. You know, the Columbo moment. Columbo's about to leave the room and he turns around and he says, oh, just one more thing I wanted to ask you. Now, so often as NEDs, we don't want to be the Columbo moment. We don't want to be the one who prolongs the discussion, but it may actually be the voice of that person. It may actually be you who thinks of something that nobody else has thought of. And you think, oh, I don't want to be tiresome, I'll not raise it. But in fact, it may well have been that kind of a comment that could have saved, say, the Grenfell tragedy, etc. So I've got 1 minute left. I've got my stopwatch going here. So final couple of points: balance, support, and challenge. You may be in challenge mode, but you can still do that in a supportive way. And similarly, you may well want to congratulate and pat people on the back, but make sure that people are being challenged as well. And as a chief executive, I want to be challenged. I don't want to just hear froth all the time. Next one, challenge the chair and the chief executive. There's a wonderful piece of work done in the housing association sector called Learning from Problem Cases. And almost invariably, when you look at what's gone wrong, it's because of the relationship between the chair and chief executive. It may look fine from the outside, but there's all kinds of things that may be bubbling away underneath. Maybe private deals being done, things not being said, etc., etc. Now, my final point is review, review, review. all the time. Just ask yourselves, how is this working? How is it for you? How could we be better, etc.? Those kinds of questions open up that sense of challenge, being transparent, opening up to criticism. By the time I had my appraisal, I think I talk about 360, just about everybody and their dog was asked what they thought of my performance as the chief executive. And so it should have been. Absolutely, get everybody's for intelligence working on the particular issue. And I'll just finish off with one thing. So this is your first question. We're leading into it. We had on the wall of SYHA, we had 9 big questions. We call them the big questions. So these are the questions we asked ourselves to bear in mind as we were going through the meeting to see if we were on the right track. So it would be, have we done a financial analysis? Is the risk assessment in place, etc., etc. One of those questions was, is the voice of the customer in the boardroom? One day, one of the NEDs sat back, he stroked his chin and he said, yeah, we're pretty good at making sure we hear the voice of the customer in all kinds of different ways in the room. What I'm not sure we do is, I don't think we test ourselves with regards to empathy for the customer experience. And that led to us going away and thinking about how we could do something about that. And as a result, we set up a human library, which many years after we did it, I can go into details if people want, but I've run out of time now. But just that sense of bringing people into the room as equals and learning from each other's experience. Okay, I'll leave it there, Ketan. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I found that incredibly useful and very powerful. We're now going to ask you to reflect on 3 questions. What would you put on the wall of your boardroom as the best prompts? So imagine a wall directly opposite you. What are those prompts that maybe only you can see that prompts you to ask the right questions or challenge? Second question is, how do you ensure the CEO and chair relationship is fully transparent and functional, so it's fit for purpose? And the third question is, what is your role as a NED in challenging poor behavior from other NED or NEDs? So yeah, what would your role be if you saw that kind of behavior?